The glass walls of the conference room didn't just reflect the Chicago skyline, they magnified the silence inside. I sat at the head of the table, a table I had commissioned from Italy 3 years ago, and watched my sister, Callista, slide a single sheet of paper across the mahogany. Motion for immediate removal based on gross fiscal negligence, she read, her voice steady. Practiced. My mother, Margot, sat 2 seats away. Studying her cuticles like this was a tedious brunch instead of an execution. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just looked at the building around me, the cantilevered steel, the light-filled atrium structures I had drawn on napkins and built from the ground up. Now, security was waiting at the door. They weren't just firing me, they were erasing me. Have you ever built the castle, only to have the people you loved lock you outside the gate? Tell me I'm not the only one in the comments. I walked into my apartment, the one place that was supposed to feel like sanctuary, but the silence followed me inside. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air before a structural collapse. The coat stayed on my shoulders. The liquor cabinet remained closed. I walked straight to my home office and woke up my laptop. I needed to access the Vanguard server. I needed to download the project files for the Riverside Library, the blueprints for the tech campus, the intellectual property that lived in my head but resided on their drives. I typed my password. Access denied. I tried the backup admin code. Access denied. Contact system administrator. They hadn't just fired me an hour ago. They had scrubbed my digital existence while I was still in the elevator. My email, my calendar, my archives, 15 years of late nights and breakthrough designs gone. It was a demolition, efficient, and total. Then came the courier. He didn't look me in the eye when he handed over the thick manila envelope. I ripped it open right there in the hallway. It was a settlement offer. $1.5 million. To anyone else, that might look like a fortune. But to me, it was an insult. That number was barely a fraction of the firm's valuation. It was a go-away fee. But the money wasn't the worst part. Clipped to the back was a non-disclosure agreement, so restrictive it would effectively ban me from practicing architecture in Chicago for 5 years. They wanted to buy my silence. They wanted to pay me to be a ghost. I picked up my phone to call George, a client I had worked with for 6 years. We had a site visit scheduled for tomorrow. I needed to explain, to get ahead of the narrative before Callista spun it. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried another client, then a contractor I'd known since I was 22. Nothing. Then, a single text came through from a junior associate who was risking her job just by messaging me. She's telling them you had a breakdown, Ximena. She's saying you gambled away project funds. They're calling it a mental health leave. I stared at the screen until the pixels blurred. A whisper campaign. Callista wasn't just taking the company, she was salting the earth so nothing I planted could ever grow again. She knew that in our industry, reputation is the only load-bearing wall that matters, and she had taken a sledgehammer to mine. I sat there in the dark, the envelope of hush money on the desk, feeling the total isolation of a pariah. I had built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, but in that moment, I couldn't even see a way out of my own living room. I thought I had hit the bottom. I thought the worst thing they could take was my career. I was wrong. The real theft hadn't even been discovered yet. The silence in the apartment broke the moment the front door opened. Mason didn't just walk in, he practically vibrated with energy, his backpack sliding off his shoulder as he held up a thick envelope with the university crest stamped in gold. "I got in," he said, his voice cracking just a little. "Mom, I actually got in." For a second, the ruin of my career didn't matter. I looked at my son, 18 years old and brilliant, standing on the precipice of the life I had engineered for him. This was the plan. This was why I worked 80-hour weeks. This was why I endured the board meetings and the politics. To build a foundation he could stand on. "I knew you would," I said, and my voice was steady. "We need to celebrate. I need to check the financial aid portal first," he said, already heading to his room. "Tuition is no joke." "Don't worry about the tuition," I called after him. "That's handled. We have the trust." But as his door clicked shut, a cold prickle of instinct ran down my spine. It wasn't fear, it was data. The variables had changed. If Callista and Margot were willing to lock me out of the firm, what else had they locked me out of? I opened my laptop again. I didn't go to the company server this time. I went to the private family trust portal. The account I had set up when Mason was born, $460,000. The cumulative sum of every bonus, every dividend, every sacrifice I had made for 18 years. I typed the password. The screen loaded. Balance. 0. No gasp escaped my lips. No scream tore through the room. I just stared at the empty field where a future used to be. I clicked on the transaction history. One single transfer, dated 3 days ago. Authorized by power of attorney. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I was back in a different room, 5 years ago. I saw the document sitting on my mother's kitchen table. I saw Margot handing me the pen, telling me it was just a formality, a safety measure in case anything happened to me on a work trip. "Just sign it, Ximena," she had said. "Don't make this difficult. We're family." And I had signed. For years, I told myself I signed it because I trusted them. But sitting in the dark of my home office, looking at the theft of my son's life, I finally admitted the truth. I didn't sign it out of trust. I signed it out of conditioning. It's what psychologists call the chain of the survivor. It's a prison without bars. Growing up, I learned that saying no to Callista meant declaring war on my mother. I learned that my role was to be the frictionless component, the one who smoothed things over, the one who kept the peace by absorbing the damage. I thought my silence was strength. I thought my compliance was loyalty. But it wasn't. It was a survival response I had practiced since I was 6 years old. I had handed them the weapon because I was trained to believe they would never pull the trigger. I looked at the screen again. The date of the transfer? 3 days ago. The realization hit me with the force of a structural failure. The whispering campaign. The fiscal negligence accusations. The buyout offer. They weren't just trying to steal the company. They had stolen Mason's money first. They knew I would find out. They knew I would come for them. So they preemptively destroyed my credibility. They painted me as unstable, reckless, and paranoid, so that when I finally stood up and pointed at the empty account, nobody would believe me. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a demolition plan. I looked at Mason's closed door. I could hear him on the phone, telling his friends the good news. He thought his life was just beginning. He didn't know his grandmother and aunt had just sold it to cover their debts. I didn't go into his room to cry. I didn't go to the kitchen to break a glass. I pulled out a fresh legal pad. They thought the power of attorney was their shield. They forgot that every transaction leaves a footprint. And I knew exactly who could find them. I met Cleo at a diner on the south side, a place where the tables were laminate and the air smelled of grease and old coffee. It was the antithesis of the glass tower I had been exiled from. There were no views here, just the stark reality of fluorescent lights. Cleo was sitting in a booth, her hands wrapped around a mug. She was a forensic accountant, a woman who read numbers like I read blueprints. Margot had hired her 3 days ago to audit my department, to manufacture the evidence they needed to justify my firing. "I didn't find what they wanted me to find," Cleo said, not looking up as I slid into the booth. "I know," I said. "I didn't steal anything." "I know you didn't." Cleo reached into her bag and pulled out a small, black flash drive. She set it on the table between us. It looked like nothing, just a piece of plastic. But I knew better. In my line of work, the smallest components often carry the heaviest loads. I found where the money actually went, Ximena. It wasn't fiscal negligence, it was leverage. "Callista," I said. It wasn't a question. "Crypto. High-risk real estate speculation in Miami." She was leveraging firm assets to cover personal margin calls. She's not just incompetent. She's underwater. Deep. It made sense. The desperation, the sudden hostility, Callista was drowning, and she needed a life raft. I was the raft. She gutted my son's future to keep her own head above water. She used the power of attorney, I said, my voice flat. She drained Mason's trust to cover her tracks before the quarterly review. Cleo looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that chilled me. "That's the thing, Ximena. The trust fund. It had a failsafe. Any transfer over $50,000 required dual authorization. The power of attorney wasn't enough on its own. The bank required a secondary digital signature from a board member. The diner noise, the clatter of plates, the hum of the refrigerator seemed to drop away. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold. Dual authorization. Who? I asked, though the answer was already forming in my gut like a stone. I traced the IP address of the second approval, Cleo said softly. It came from the penthouse. It was Margot's digital key. The world didn't spin. It stopped. It wasn't just Callista. My mother, the woman who sat at my table for Thanksgiving, the woman who knit Mason a blanket when he was born. She hadn't just looked the other way. She had logged in. She had entered her password. She had authorized the theft of her grandson's future to save her favorite daughter's reputation. It was the shadow signature, the invisible hand that had controlled the architecture of my life for 30 years. She chose, I whispered. She chose Callista over Mason. She countersigned the transfer at 11:42 at night on Tuesday, Cleo said, pushing the flash drive closer to me. Everything is on there. The server logs, the IP traces, the emails where they discussed how to frame you. It's encrypted. The password is your son's birthday. I looked at the drive. It was the encryption key to my vindication, but it was also the death certificate of my family. I picked it up. It felt cold in my hand. Why are you giving me this? I asked. You work for them. I work for the truth, Cleo said, standing up. And I don't like being used to frame innocent people. Burn them down, Ximena. Make sure they don't get up. I watched her walk out into the gray morning. I sat there for a long time, gripping the drive until it warmed against my skin. I didn't feel sad. Sadness is for things you can fix. This was beyond repair. This was a structural failure so profound, the only option was demolition. I put the drive in my pocket. I had the blueprints. Now, I just needed the detonator. The Vanguard Design annual gala was held in the atrium I had designed. It was a soaring cathedral of glass and steel, meant to capture the light, but tonight, it was being used to hide the darkness. I stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, watching. Below me, 300 of Chicago's elite investors, city planners, clients, sipped champagne and applauded. On the stage, bathed in a spotlight that cost more than my first car, stood Callista. She was accepting the Golden Compass Award for ethical leadership. The irony wasn't just rich, it was suffocating. Integrity, Callista said into the microphone, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. It isn't just about the structures we build, it's about the foundations we protect. My mother, Margot, sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. It was a perfect performance. A beautiful facade, but I knew better than anyone that a facade without a foundation is just a heavy curtain waiting to fall. Storming the stage would be emotional. Grabbing the microphone would be desperate. I pulled out my phone. I had spent the last hour syncing with the venue's guest Wi-Fi, isolating the IP addresses of the board members, the major investors, and the industry press sitting in the first 5 rows. I had the distribution list. I opened the file Cleo had given me: Vanguard, Forensic, Audit, Executive, Summary, PDF. I hit send all. The reaction wasn't instantaneous. It rippled. First, a phone lit up in the 3rd row. Then, a smartwatch buzzed in the front. Then, the distinct, soft ping of an airdrop notification echoed from a pocket near the stage. It started as a murmur. A head bent down. A frown. A nudge to a neighbor. Did you get this? On stage, Callista faltered. She lost her place in the teleprompter. She saw the head of the investment board pull out his tablet, his face turning ashen as he scrolled through the receipts. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the digital evidence of a felony. I watched her freeze. And in that moment, I understood something profound about my sister. It's a concept called the illusion of the empty wallet. We assume that powerful people crumble because they lose their money. But that's not it. They crumble because their entire identity is based on having, not being. Callista had the title of CFO. She had the corner office, she had the stolen money, but she was nothing. She had no talent for design, no instinct for business, no grit. Her confidence was a rental, paid for with the currency of appearance. I looked at myself in the reflection of the glass. I had no job, I had no money. But I was still an architect. I could be dropped in the middle of a desert with a pencil, and I could build a shelter. I had intrinsic value. Callista had nothing but the prop. And I had just kicked the chair out from under her. The murmur in the room grew into a roar. The investor stood up, holding his tablet like a weapon. He locked eyes with Callista. She looked out into the crowd, searching for an ally, searching for Margot. But Margot was staring at her own phone, her face a mask of horror, not for her daughter, but for her own exposure. The shadow signature was on page 4. Callista looked up then. She saw me on the mezzanine. No wave, no smile, just the turn of my heel as I walked out. The structure was already coming down. I didn't need to stay for the dust. The collapse of the Vanguard empire wasn't a slow erosion, it was a controlled demolition. 48 hours after the gala, the emergency board meeting was convened. This time, I wasn't the one being escorted out. I was the primary witness. The conference room was identical to the one where they had fired me, but the atmosphere had inverted. The air wasn't cold, it was frantic. The board members, men and women who had watched silently as I was erased weeks ago, were now scrambling to distance themselves from the blast radius. Callista wasn't there. She was reportedly indisposed, meeting with criminal defense attorneys. Margot was there. She sat at the far end of the table, not studying her cuticles this time, but clutching a glass of water with a trembling hand. She looked smaller. The matriarchal facade had cracked, revealing the desperate woman underneath. The motion to remove Callista Sterling and Margot Sterling from the board of directors, the chairman announced, his voice tight, effective immediately, pending criminal investigation. The vote took 30 seconds. Unanimous. They didn't do it for justice, they did it for liability. They were cutting off the gangrenous limb to save the body. I watched it happen with the detachment of an auditor. It wasn't satisfaction. It was just gravity. As the meeting adjourned, Margot cornered me in the hallway. The security guards hesitated, looking to me for a signal, but I held up a hand. I needed to hear this. Ximena, she said, her voice dropping to that hushed, conspiratorial tone she used to use when we were fixing Callista's mistakes in high school. You have to stop the police investigation. The board fired us. That's enough punishment. You can't send your sister to prison. I didn't send her, I said. The wire fraud statute did. She's family, Margot hissed, grabbing my arm. We are your blood. You don't destroy your own blood. I looked at her hand on my sleeve. For 30 years, that touch had been a command. It was the physical anchor of the chain of the survivor. She had trained me to believe that my endurance was the glue holding the family together. She had taught me that being the good daughter meant absorbing the shockwaves so Callista didn't have to. But looking at her now, I realized the chain wasn't made of loyalty. It was made of fear. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was asking for my submission. She wanted me to crawl back into the cage she had built for me, just to keep her world comfortable. I carefully removed her hand from my arm. You stole from Mason, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it echoed in the empty corridor. You didn't just choose her over me. You chose her debt over his future. You broke the bloodline, Margot. I'm just filing the paperwork. I will never forgive you for this, she spat, the mask finally falling away completely. I know, I said. And I don't care. My eyes stayed forward as I walked straight to the waiting detectives in the lobby. They asked if I wanted to press charges for the theft of the trust fund. They asked if I was willing to testify regarding the unauthorized server access and the falsified financial records. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back at the glass elevator where my mother stood watching. Yes, I said. I want to press charges. Every single one. It wasn't revenge. It was structural integrity. You can't build a safe future on a rotten foundation. You have to clear the site first. 6 months later, the view from my new office was different. I wasn't on the 45th floor looking down at the city like a god. I was on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse in the West Loop, looking straight at the steel and brick of the skyline. The sign on the frosted glass door didn't say Vanguard, it said Horizon Studios. The space was smaller, the furniture was second-hand, mid-century modern, not imported Italian leather. But the air here was different. It didn't smell like fear and recycled ambition. It smelled like fresh coffee and wet concrete. It smelled like work. My phone buzzed on the drafting table. It was a text from Mason, a picture of him standing in front of the library at Penn, wearing a hoodie I had bought him before he left. First midterm done. I think I crushed it, the caption read. I smiled, and for the first time in 30 years, the expression didn't feel like a mask I had to put on. The tuition wasn't being paid by a stolen trust fund. It was being paid by restitution checks and the retainer from my first 3 independent clients. Callista wasn't posting about leadership anymore. Her social media had gone dark the day the indictment came down. The last I heard from Cleo, my sister was trying to leverage a plea deal, trading information on Margot's past financial maneuverings for a reduced sentence on the wire fraud charges. They were eating each other. The snake was finally swallowing its own tail. And Margot? She was alone in the penthouse. I knew she called me every Sunday at 6 in the evening. I knew because I saw the blocked notification in my call log on Monday mornings. I never listened to the voicemails. I didn't need to. I knew what they said. They would be variations of the same plea: family, blood, loyalty. But I had redesigned my definition of those words. Loyalty wasn't a suicide pact. Family wasn't a hierarchy of abuse. I walked to the window. The sun was setting over Chicago, turning the glass towers into pillars of fire. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over because they took my title. I thought I was nothing without the firm I had built. But standing here, holding the blueprints for a new community center in Bronzeville, I realized the truth. They didn't take my talent, they didn't take my vision, they just took the overhead. I looked at the drafting table. A blank sheet of vellum was taped down, waiting for the first line. That was the best part of being an architect. No matter how much rubble is on the ground, you can always clear the site. You can always pour a new foundation. I picked up my pencil. I wasn't building for them anymore. I was building for Mason. I was building for myself. They tried to bury me, but they forgot I was the architect. I didn't just dig my way out. I built a staircase. If you're ready to start building yours, hit subscribe. We have work to do.